Hey, this is King Jimmy Un-Author-ized. I just wanted to take a moment and tell you that God's judgments are not always a bad thing. Now, as Christians, we kind of feel this need to almost apologize for God's judgments. We almost feel embarrassed, especially in modern evangelical Christianity, to even mention the fact that there's a God and there's a God who judges, and we shy away from even speaking that certain events in history may in fact be the judgment of God. I don't think we need to do that. I think we need to re-understand why judgment can actually sometimes really be a good thing. In my church lately, we've been doing a book study on the book of Jeremiah, and the topic keeps coming up over and over and over that there was a God who judged the Jewish people in 586 with the Babylonian exile and the destruction of Jerusalem and all the terrible things that happened at that period of time. But when you actually look at the judgments that God pronounced against Israel and against Judah back in those days with the Assyrians and the Babylonians, we actually see that God's judgment was actually a form of His compassion, because in judging the people and Judah and Israel that God, in the way that God did, He woke them up to something. He made them realize that the stories that they heard about with Moses and the Exodus and the great deliverance that they had experienced under Pharaoh through God, that there was indeed a God who acts in history. There is a God who intervenes in the behalf of mankind's affairs, and they had forgotten that. And His judgment against them as a nation and as a people was an awakening that they experienced, and an opportunity to respond, to say, yes, there still is a God who intervenes in the affairs of mankind, and He's waking you up to this fact, and that He loves you and cares for you and wants you to return to Him, to find restoration for your souls, and to find the life that He would have you to live, so that you may have the abundant life that He had promised through Abraham and Moses. That this God is intervening in the affairs of history, and He is intervening through judgment. Up until that point, for many, God was fundamentally no different than any of the idols that they worshipped in Babylon or Assyria. He was fundamentally no different than Baal or Ashtaroth. But in judgment, He revealed His mighty hand and ultimately caused those people in those days to realize that there is a God who intervenes in history, and He is different than all the idols of the world. My second point about judgment is I would like to say that judgment can often take and transform into a form of chastisement at the end of the day. There's a judgment in the very final sense that this is 100% retributive, that this is 100% about justice, and this is ultimately about punishing you for your sins. And there's a very frightening judgment of God that the Scriptures talk about in those terms. However, things don't have to be that way if you respond to God's judgment. If you look at it as an opportunity to awaken, as the Jews eventually did with their Babylonian exile, that judgment actually becomes a form of chastisement and something that becomes a form of restoration. And restoration and an opportunity to grow. I know some of the greatest events in my life ultimately happened because I looked and saw God's hand on my life. I saw when He pulled the carpet out from underneath my feet, left me exposed. I saw in moments of my life when I felt like God was beating me within an inch of my life. And those are the moments that actually turned out for opportunities for growth. So how I responded to God's judgment, how I responded to His intervening in my life, to circumstances, ultimately determined the result of it. I could have responded to God in a very negative way, and in a very angered way, and in a very stubborn way, and just stiffened my neck and hardened my heart. And I could have not responded to God, and those judgments might have ended up being final in my life. But those judgments that I experienced actually ended up being something that softened my heart and made me open to receiving some much needed correction in my own life. And it allowed me to adjust the course that I was on and get on the course that I feel I'm in many ways today, where God's judgment on my life ultimately ended up being a great form of correction and bringing a much needed change in direction in my life. So it's ultimately what I made of it. I could have been destroyed, or I could respond in a way such as to bring about new life into my own life. So judgment's not always a bad thing. And third and final, and probably the most important point I would like to make, is that we shouldn't feel embarrassed about God's judgment, because God's judgment and his hammer ultimately found itself on the cross of Christ. Everything that is due to us, the stroke due to us, the punishment due to us, the chastisement due to us, the Bible teaches ultimately fell on Jesus Christ. And I don't know about you, but I find that an amazing good thing, that Jesus Christ took my punishment, that he took my wrath, that he took my judgment upon himself, so that I can ultimately enter into the relationship that is possible with the God today because of what he accomplished on the cross, because of the judgment he endured on the cross. The judgment he endured allowed the judgment that I'm ultimately due to be taken away. So, at the end of the day, I think if we're to be good theologians here, we ultimately need to recognize that the judgment of God can in many ways not be such a bad thing, and it should actually be something that we open ourselves up to and in many ways welcome in our life, because judgment doesn't have to end in judgment. Judgment can actually ultimately end in restoration and growth, an opportunity for new things ultimately available through Jesus Christ. So this is King Jimmy Unauthorized. If you feel like God is judging you, and there's actually a possibility he might be, embrace that judgment. Do something with it. Don't just wallow in it and say, woe is me. Why has this happened to me? Look and see what opportunity God can't accomplish through that judgment. Have a good day.